Hi everyone. For my two tools that I use in my classroom that I'm going to be kind of looking at, one of them is a sequencing cut and paste. So for example, it's a worksheet that the students would be getting. We read a story about carving a pumpkin. As you can see on the bottom, there's all the pictures that go with it. Then the students have to cut the pictures out and put them in the correct order, matching them with the numbers. We usually do a practice with it beforehand where they get to see kind of where the picture would go, and then I need to see if they do it on their own. So I kind of broke mine into the three parts that they talked about: engagement, representation, and action. So for engagement, it only offers really one way for the child to show what they know. So they might not be so engaged if they're not inclined to doing the cut and paste. If it's someone who has a harder time using the cut and paste or things like that, they might not be as inclined to do it. On the other hand, though, someone who is really interested in cutting and pasting, they do keep their engagement a little bit longer than the other students because they're excited to do that. It's something active that they can be doing to be doing the cut and paste. It does not hit on the internalization part of it much. They're not really reflecting on what they're learning. They're not really looking at how they can apply this later. They're just kind of cutting and pasting, so it doesn't really hit on that part of accessibility. For representation, it is very colorful. It is something that's eye-catching for the students. They like the colored pictures. They like being able to manipulate the items on their own. There's really not an option for the auditory informational students. So if a student wanted to tell me the order, since there is so many students in my class, I don't really have the option of them verbally retelling the story to me because that would take way too long to do that with all of my students. So most of them have to be able to do this. So it doesn't really hit on all of my learners for the accessibility part. It does get those hands-on students, though, to work a little bit better because they're able to cut out all the pictures, put them where they think they're supposed to go, and they can manipulate and reorder them as they are thinking about the story. In terms of action, they do have physical action with the scissors. They get to use their cutting hands, so they get to cut the pictures out like I've stated before. So that's really something accessible. Unless the student has an issue with scissors and cutting, then it definitely isn't something that's accessible for them, and there would have to be other accommodations to go into it. Again, also they get to move the pictures around, so that's something physical that they can be doing to help them decide where the pictures are supposed to go, what order they go in. The other thing I was going to talk about is my slideshow presentations that I use for my math lessons. So for the engagement, it's really only one way for them to help out them to do things. So for example, this is my first slide. It says I can show two ways to write the same number sentence. So we talk about a number sentence. It's just kind of what are they all going to be doing. For representation, it does have pictures as well as different ways for them to answer, so they can give me what this thing is called here. It's called a number bond, so if they can fill in my number bond, they can give me multiple ways to write the number sentence, so we talk about multiple ways to write a number sentence. Later on in the lesson, they get to work with a partner, so they get to share ideas going back and forth. So they get to do talk to a partner, they get to figure out what's going on, so that's more of a physical action right there, because they get to turn and talk. They get to move things around. So if they're working on a whiteboard while this is happening on the board, they do have something that they can be physically using. It is only asking one thing of the students to be doing, so it's kind of, it's not too accessible to all of them. So if a student has a hard time with counting these up on the board on their own without having it physically in front of them, that's something that I would have to add in as an accommodation for that student, having physical manipulative. So accessibility wise, some of the students would have a hard time accessing this. In regards to some of the representation, they talk about making sure that it's hitting on something that's prior knowledge. The application problem that we start with always hits on what we did the day before, so that they're kind of looking at what did we do the day before, practicing that before we move into our next lesson. Overall, I know that most of my things that I do in class with the general education students, we are constantly modifying and differentiating it for the other learners inside of my classroom. We rarely have only one way of doing things or one way of teaching a lesson. There's usually about two or three different things happening with the different lessons in my classroom. So I'd say they're probably not individually accessible to all of my students, but overall, with all the other accommodations and modifications that we have going on inside of my classroom, all the students are able to access the information.